test. I'll give the practice test tomorrow in class. So if you're going to be gone tomorrow, get it today. And I know there's all kinds of stuff going on, but we just got to deal with it. And I just got to go. Secondly, I will do a review session tonight at 6 p.m. Pay attention here. I don't want to repeat myself 5 times. The doors will be open up there. Go before 6, 10, 6:20 or I'm sorry, 6:20. 10 to 6 or so. And I will try to record it. But I understand people are going to be gone, but I'm going to cover a lot of things. So I'm going to go over as much as I can. Then that's the best I can do. I try to get as much as I can. There's a lot of stuff. And what else? If enough people want to do it, I might review a little bit at lunch today. So that'll be up to you. And other than that, hey, let's get started. Did we get to this?
We got Soviets.
No, probably not.
They removed this from Turkey right there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. So Cuban Missile Crisis is over, and this is about as close as people realize of actual nuclear war. So they came back from the break. And basically, so we didn't have this. The Soviet Union and the U.S. agreed to a limited test ban treaty. 23 years later, there'd be a full test ban treaty. And so the pullback from all the testing, at least above atmosphere, they still did testing underground. And they set up a direct communication line, a telegraph line, between the Kremlin and the White House called the hotline. Everyone thought it was like a red phone, but no, it was a telegraph line. And so they could have at least direct communication. That line still exists. And even though now it's a little bit more advanced, but still, it's the same basic idea. There could be communication outside of doing everything they did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there, Kennedy and Khrushchev, let's get a catch on this thing. But in reality, Khrushchev was very much humiliated. And in 1964, Khrushchev is going to be ousted from power. And he basically sent into exile in his dacha, his country estate. And ironically, that decision will end the Cold War. It's just going to take till 1989. The Soviets are never going to fall behind again. And so their new leadership, basically a group of people, the first among equals would be Leonid Brezhnev. My vision of the Soviet Union are those eyebrows when I was a kid, but never fall behind again. And they began a drastic program to build as many ICBMs and nuclear weapons as possible, so they would not be humiliated. And so that's where we get the situation by the end of the 1960s, where both the United States and the Soviet Union can destroy the world, literally destroy the world hundreds of times over. And this buildup would lead to 50% of the Soviet economy going towards the military. And that was totally unsustainable. And by the late 70s, early 1980s, the Soviet economy began to collapse. And that would be the beginning of the end. We're building all these weapons. These are actually surface-to-air missiles, but ICBMs right here, going through Red Square. And it's actually kind of funny. The CIA would be reporting in the early 1980s, the Soviet Union's stronger than ever, and their economy is booming. And they were 180 degrees wrong. Gee, the CIA. But that would be the end. So they would build all these weapons, and they would go to naught. But let's get back to this. I'm going to be clear. We're saying this today. They did not know that in the 1960s. But this is why the Soviet Union abandoned the attempt to go to the moon. Everything had to go to nuclear weapons. So they basically abandoned it by 1965, especially by 67. So jumping right to here. And so while this is going on, there are still events in the United States, and nothing happens in a vacuum. So Kennedy's prestige might have went up temporarily, but civil rights and his promises not being met would begin to drag him down, but also the backlash against the civil rights movement. The SCLC, along with the NAACP, so the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC, Martin Luther King was one of the leading members of that. They and other groups organized sit-ins in segregated lunch counters, segregated bus stations, basically go in as acts of civil disobedience. And this is direct action. So this is going to force the authorities to act. And they really did not want to arrest people for violating these laws. And remember, this is a morality play. Good versus evil. Who's good in these pictures? By the way, you notice they're both young people. And we're talking basically your age to early 20s doing this. And bravely sitting there, taking ridicule, and they're dumping their drinks, and that's mustard, and they're being dumped on them for sitting in these these segregated lunch counters, demanding equal rights, or them doing that. Who's good? Who's evil? This is direct action. Hey, the country has to make up their mind. And this is going to be bitterly opposed by some people, even though now it's kind of lionized. People forget the opposition. They shouldn't, though. People, nonviolent civil disobedience is bitterly opposed to this day. Also, freedom riders. And they're going to protest segregated buses by purposely integrating buses in the South and challenging Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. They're also in the process trying to register voters. And here's the route some of the freedom riders took, knowing that they're risking attack, especially in ultra-segregated Mississippi and Alabama. The freedom riders. This is another direct action civil disobedience. And both of these are to force people like Kennedy and liberal Democrats, or especially Democrats, to act, and some Republicans who promise civil rights. And so here are the riders. And in Alabama, outside Birmingham, the state police, equivalent of our highway patrol, blocked the road where these buses, they're Greyhound buses, and stood back and watched as gangs waving Confederate battle flags threw Molotov cocktails, fire bombs, and destroyed their bus. And then the state police moved in and attacked the freedom riders. There's the tooth out. That's John L. Lewis, who would be elected to the Congress from Georgia for 28 years. One of the members, one of the leading fighters of the civil rights movement, would speak at the March on Washington. Very, very nervous about it. He passed away 6 years ago. And still, with other protests going on and demanding rights, Kennedy really did not push his Civil Rights Act. And so, the leader, I almost forgot this, the most vocal and therefore best known pro-segregationist politician in the South was the Democratic governor of Alabama, George Wallace. And you don't need to write this down, but this was his most famous quote. You have to write him down, but not this part. The most famous quote in his inauguration address in 1963, when he was re-elected for governor in 62. I don't think he's really hiding what he believes in. And yes, Confederate battle flags would be everywhere with bumper stickers and everything else. Here he is standing in front of the Office of Admissions in the University of Alabama, where he said he would stand at the schoolhouse door to keep black students out of the University of Alabama. Here's a stand down with the assistant Attorney General, Lawrence Katzenbach, would be Lyndon Johnson's Attorney General. So we'll come back to Wallace. But that is why the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August of 1963, would be organized to push Kennedy. He promised to do something about civil rights and was doing very little. Despite the hard work of members of the Senate like Hubert Humphrey or Mike Mansfield of Montana. Montana was a vastly different state than today, pushing for civil rights. And, recording this? I think so, yeah. 63. It was to push Kennedy. And it was organized by the NAACP, the SCLC, also the United Auto Workers and Labor Unions, part of the reasons why labor unions were so opposed by the leaders of the South. And thousands would come to this march, and it was more than just fighting for these civil rights. One of the big emphasis through every speech, especially Martin Luther King, was economic justice. To do something about the significantly higher poverty rate amongst African Americans, and the fact that with white flight, areas of the north in these northern cities where most African Americans were forced to live were becoming what they were known as ghettos. Remember it went over the urban blight and all that, what a weird way to put it. And these are the leaders of the march. These are all the speakers lined up right here. There's John Lewis, who I showed you a year ago, had his jaw broke. That picture right there. There's Walter Abernathy, there's King, Victor Ruther, the head of United Auto Workers. Here they are meeting Kennedy, and Kennedy begged them not to do it. Begged them, pleaded with them, because it made Kennedy look bad, because he couldn't get anything done. Kennedy was kind of popular after the Cuban Missile Crisis. His popularity was dropping dramatically by the early fall of 1963. So they still did it anyways and carried it out. I'm going to come back and talk about this right after the test. But the whole point was to push Kennedy to act. And that is why Kennedy really is kind of embarrassed about his New Frontiers record. It was not working. And there was a huge, what's called a conservative backlash. A backlash against the civil rights movement and against the idea that they're asking too much. They're going too fast. It's disrupting society. Oh, sure, nobody really likes the Jim Crow laws, but come on now, we have to have reason here. And so this gives you an idea about the opinion of the March on Washington from a Gallup poll. 60% of Americans said they were unfavorable to the March on Washington. Oh, Martin Luther King was despised amongst most white Americans in the 1960s. And this was put up all over the South, claiming that Martin Luther King was a communist. And this is communist training school. It's not at all communist training school. But, they just put a sign up and this was all over. And so this backlash is going to grow and grow and grow. This will be the basis of, you see this conservative backlash really growing in the conservative revival of the 1970s. But we're jumping right to here. But South Vietnam still raged. That civil war the United States was involved in, Kennedy eventually is going to send. There were about 1,500 advisors when he took office, eventually 18,000 U.S. advisors, and helicopter pilots, and the United States Navy and Air Force were secretly bombing not just South, but North Vietnam in the Civil War in the South. North Vietnam was aiding the Viet Cong. And it was going very badly. Kennedy, because of the Cold War, his failure to pass laws and trying to look tough, is making Vietnam very important. South Vietnam. The reasons he committed the United States. So he committed, I know I keep on putting myself in the present, I can't help it. When I do this, I do the present. I put myself in the air. The domino theory, of course, but also don't forget Berlin was on everybody's mind. And then Kennedy felt he had to be tough about civil rights, and he's embarrassed about it, so he wanted something tough. And then, of course, he's going to run for re-election in 1964. He needs positive things on his record. In fact, they're going to really try to act like the South Vietnamese government has just about defeated the Viet Cong near the end of his life. It wasn't nowhere near the truth. They were just barely holding on. And the Viet Cong was getting better. The North was aiding them just as the United States is aiding the South Vietnamese. So in Kennedy's last speech he gave, the last speech he ever gave in Fort Worth, Texas, at a breakfast luncheon, the big elements of the speech were bragging about all the weapons he built in his defense buildup, especially the Minuteman missiles in Montana, and we're winning in South Vietnam. Democracy is on the march. His last speech he gave. He was going to give a similar speech. He gave that speech in the morning. He was going to give a similar speech at noon in Dallas, Texas. But the Diem government by then was known as being very corrupt. And many people in the South did not trust him, partially because of how corrupt he was. He promised democracy, and he was Catholic. Now, it wasn't so much the religion, but the French colonists were Catholic. So those who converted were seen as collaborators with the French. And so it's like the colonial rule never left. So he is very corrupt. Very corrupt. Diem, the government, the president of South Vietnam. And they should have, the flag of South Vietnam was almost identical to the flag of French Indochina. Just, why are you doing that? So, generals in South Vietnam were getting very worried because there were street protests all over big cities against Diem's corruption. Most famously, in 1963, Buddhist monks protesting Zen began to light themselves on fire on streets in South Vietnam. They committed this horrible suicide to try to bring people's attention to the corruptness of the Zen government. So these pictures will become one of the pictures that people who are alive at this time remember about Vietnam. They might get it wrong. It was protesting the Zen government. This is in 63. And they're not doing well in the war. So, when South Vietnamese generals said, hey, we want to overthrow them, Kennedy reluctantly agreed. This is October 1963. They agreed on a coup. Zen was not supposed to be killed, but he was actually brutally beaten and shot in the back of an armored personnel carrier. Now, Zen said Kennedy was actually shaken by this, but he approved the coup. Now, the United States did not do the coup. This was South Vietnamese officers with American weapons. We gave them. But a series of generals, this is Nguyen Dam. You don't even know his name because it's going to be one of many military dictators. And now the United States is stuck with these military dictators. We have no choice but to support them now. We are now tied to these dictators who, there'd be a coup, they said democracy's coming, another coup. They just kind of rotated them around in circles. So finally one general took over in 77 and would rule for the rest of South Vietnam, a guy named II. But the point is, we're stuck with them. The Kennedy administration, by approving this coup, everybody believed the United States put these guys in, and now we're stuck. A similar thing's going to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan in your lifetime. We're going to be stuck with corrupt leaders because we just have no choice. So Kennedy tries to claim this is the next George Washington, Dim. Didn't matter. Because on that campaign trip I told you about in Fort Worth, Texas, he flew, I know it's very close, but they flew to Dallas, where he was going to give another speech on our way to the Trade Mart on November 22nd. Less than 2 months after Zen was killed, John Kennedy was assassinated. He was assassinated on the way. I should add, there were a bunch of protesters against Kennedy waving umbrellas. You remember Munich, saying he's appeasing the Soviets. Texas, I don't know if you know this, but Texas is an interesting state. Well, a couple hours later, after murdering a police officer, Lee Harvey Oswald murdered a police officer. He was arrested, and they put it together that it's pretty clear he assassinated President Kennedy. And the evidence was overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. They had the rifle, they have a picture with him with the rifle. He was a devoted communist. He actually tried to defect to the Soviet Union and fled there, lived there for 2 years, came back, was miserable, tried to defect to Cuba, was obsessed with Castro. And normally in the normal cases would have been cut and dry, but this is also the assassination of the president, which by the way was not yet a federal crime, which just seems so weird. It was just a state crime. I know, today it's a federal crime. Back then it wasn't. I know, that seems weird. But what made it even more weird is a combination of how inept the Dallas police force was. 2 days later, a strip club owner by the name of Jack Ruby assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald. And that is a picture of Ruby just before he shot Oswald. This was on TV. They were broadcasting his transference to the county jail where it would be safer. Oswald is being walked out right there, and Ruby shot him, killed him. Ruby would die a few years later in prison of pancreatic cancer. But this now made it very strange. Why was he trying to silence him? Now, there's no evidence. There's no concrete evidence of anybody but Oswald and Ruby acting alone, or Oswald acting alone. But you can imagine how incredibly strange this really does appear. Well, the big worry for the brand new president, Lyndon Johnson, that people are going to think it was the Soviets or the Cubans. Remember Operation Mongoose to assassinate Castro? And they might want World War III. So LBJ kind of strong-armed, because LBJ was good at strong-arming people, the Chief Justice to lead a commission. But this was an incredible investigation involving hundreds of FBI agents, actually thousands of FBI agents, and congressional investigators to investigate the assassination. And they wanted to prove it was not the Russians or the Cubans. And it turned out they found that there was no evidence that was anybody other than Oswald. But a few years later, here's Warren giving the report. I've actually never read the official Warren report, and for valid reason, I'm just not going to read 15,000 pages, but I've read the summary of it, which is about 550 pages, and people start to believe maybe it was a government cover-up. Maybe they're covering up the real assassin, or maybe the government was involved. Maybe it was the CIA. Remember, Kennedy was mad at the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. Maybe it was people wanting to get involved in the Vietnam War. Maybe it was organized crime. Maybe it was aliens. We don't know. But today, the vast majority of Americans believe there was a conspiracy involving the US government to kill President Kennedy. Evidence? Well, we don't really need evidence for that. They believe that. And part of the reason would be there's going to be events coming up. There are going to be people distrust the government. And so then, yeah, it must have been Kennedy. And one thing I should add, the FBI and CIA screwed up so bad. And they covered up information. They didn't tell everything they knew to the Warren Commission. They screwed up because the FBI had Oswald under surveillance because he defected to the Soviet Union and came back. And so the important thing to understand is the FBI screwed up so bad it's hard to put in terms. So what did they do? They try to hide how bad they screwed up. CIA did too. Wow, they screwed up. But back to this. The new president, Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson, he took the reins of power like no president before or since has ever done. And Johnson wanted to make his own presidency. So he will do, Kennedy couldn't get anything passed, Johnson's going to get it all passed. He called his program something that is almost impossible to imagine today. A president saying, we're going to make a better society for everybody, a great society. Here he is at the commencement address at the University of Michigan, giving the speech in 1964. These are the old school teleprompters. And Lyndon Johnson, yeah. Lyndon Johnson. And there will never be a president like him. There were three main parts. Number one, he will get civil rights done. And he doesn't care about, remember that term, the filibuster. Does that sound familiar to everybody, the filibuster? Number two, he will end the scourge of poverty in the United States, he claimed. The poverty rate was still at over 25% in the richest country in the world, especially in certain areas of the country like the South, Appalachia, rural areas, and especially amongst African Americans. He's going to end it. And lastly, he wanted a general improvement of cultural growth. Money for education, money for arts, money for humanities. I mean, this was going to be an incredible program. And Johnson, because there's no one ever like Johnson, it's going to get over 1,000 bills passed. No president in American history will get more of his own bills passed than Lyndon Johnson. I mean, today, nothing's passed. There's been a few bills, but almost nothing. Johnson was a master of this legislation. And the first thing, civil rights. That bill that was languishing, going nowhere under Kennedy, Johnson, along with allies in the United States Senate, are going to push it through a Southern Democratic filibuster and get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Almost all Southern Democrats voted against this. And remember, this is a Southern Democratic president. All Northern Democrats and most Northern Republicans voted with this. So it was pretty bipartisan. But remember, a filibuster, that small group of Southern senators tried to stop it. Now, they put in a poison pill, which they thought would kill the bill. You notice it says no discrimination based upon race. But you see that next part? They added sex, meaning there could be no discrimination of women. And they thought nobody would ever vote for that. No way would that vote. Well, they totally underestimated the goal of most Democrats in the North, but also Lyndon Johnson. And so that passed. And that is why the Civil Rights Bill is one of the most important laws in history. This said no discrimination based upon race. Also, your ethnic background, religion is also added, but here's the biggie, also sex. So that meant over half the population could not be discriminated against. But remember something I've told you before. The 14th Amendment is not clear who a citizen is. So the 14th Amendment, technically, only males are citizens. So you can pass a law, but the Constitution does not protect that. And so laws can be changed. So that's why women, yes, cannot be discriminated according to that law. Is that going to happen? That's another story. But laws can be changed. Women are not guaranteed equal rights under the Constitution today. Anyways, yeah, kind of a big law. You also get a Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Also a vote, and there'll be 3 more Civil Rights Acts. Lyndon Johnson was just an amazing legislator. He understood how to get things done. That's what politics are. We too often confuse politics with just running for office and trying to become, president or senator, this kind of narcissistic goals of look how great I am, I won an election. Real politics is getting things done. That's what matters, and that's sometimes it's understated, and Johnson understood that. How he did it, they literally called it the Johnson treatment. I will tell you Johnson's stories after the exam, and you will not believe the stuff he did as president. But he would cajole, beg, threaten, and personal space did not matter to Lyndon Johnson. He would get right in your face and, where this is pictured, he was both, I can imagine, beloved and also hated because of this. Interesting guy. I think a lot, like all of these. And we're jumping right to here. So the election of 1964, Johnson wants to win on his own. The Civil Rights Act was passed. And as we can see from this pass, they found you. Just go right in. Sound good? Just remember real comments. Sound good? I'm sure it's just the picks up now. So he's going to run on his own. His running mate is the tireless fighter for equal rights from Minnesota, Hubert Horatio Humphrey. So we have LBJ and HQ. Get it? Hubert Horatio Humphrey. Get it? Get it? Humphrey. LBJ and Johnson. LBJ and HHH. And the Great Society. Now, they got to still have this problem. South Vietnam is not going well. But the Republicans are going to have a radical shift. They literally called it the conservative insurgency. And they nominated, this was seen as an extreme conservative. Today he'd be almost liberal, the Republican Party. Named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater, get it? AUH2O. Get it? Get it? Get it? So, I'm sorry. And this actually surprised people. He swept in through a series, hard work, calling in favors, and anger over having liberal Republicans like Dwight Eisenhower. And they called their plan the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was Goldwater, unlike most Republicans, was opposed to civil rights. He was opposed. And so that's what they ran. And this would get the biggest applause line. He would talk about it being a states' rights issue, a privacy issue. How dare you force businesses to do business with anybody regardless of race or sex. But he was also violently anti-communist, and that's what he really wanted to talk about, getting the commies. He talked about turning North Vietnam, because it's aiding the Viet Cong, he talked about turning North Vietnam into a glowing parking lot. I think you know what that means. And he talked casually about dropping an atomic bomb, literally, his words, in the bathroom of the Kremlin. So he's casually talking about World War III. That one people didn't like. But he also claimed because of policies like the Great Society, American traditional values were being hammered. And this is the beginning of what we would today call the cultural war. And the big thing they hit on, look at those protesters. They don't know their place. So you're going to see by the end of the decade, the same argument would be against the women's rights movement. women don't know their place. And this is a good example of this. So LBJ Civil Rights Bill, because of that bill, white workers are going to be fired and black workers will take their place. Pretty amazing use of pictures. They'll vote Goldwater. They weren't hiding what they were saying. This is a radical shift for the Republican Party. But the thing is, Johnson understood. Most people liked his policies. He was popular, and he's in the legacy of Kennedy, who's kind of becoming a martyr. All he had to do is prove he's tough on communism, but not going to blow the world up. How did he do it? This happened. It was going bad in South Vietnam. It's going to be called the Tonkin Gulf Incident, and it's over 2 days, on the 2nd and the 4th of 1964. The United States had been supporting South Vietnamese commandos. When I mean supporting, South Vietnamese commandos were raiding North Vietnam, trying to cut off aid for the Viet Cong. It was failing miserably. The U.S. Navy, including ships like the Maddox right here, were actually shelling North Vietnam secretly. The U.S. was actually secretly at war in South Vietnam and attacking North Vietnam. And so, on the 2nd, North Vietnamese torpedo boats, just after this attack, came out and attacked the Maddox, a U.S. destroyer. Those are a picture of them. And we know they attacked. They shelled them. We know this happened. And people said to Johnson, his advisors, use this as an excuse to show you're tough. Fight back against the North. But he didn't want to because this actually was illegal supporting of this South Vietnamese attack. So they sent 2 ships, the Maddox and another one, back on a second mission 2 days later, no South Vietnamese commandos. And they reported a second attack. They said there's torpedoes in the water, the North Vietnamese attack. They started doing radical maneuvers. In fact, the 2 U.S. ships nearly shot each other. They were so crazy. Johnson heard all this information and announced a retaliation. U.S. carrier planes attacked North Vietnamese harbors, but it was an attack, but not World War III. We're tough on communism. We strike back. 2 American planes would be shot down, and one of those pilots would end up being held as a prisoner until 1973. And this is a really complex thing. We're not at war with North Vietnam. By definition, this is a war crime. But anyways, it would turn out there was no second attack. It did not happen at all. In fact, Johnson would later say those Navy men were shooting out a bunch of damn flying fish. They just were panicked and they freaked out. But Johnson never told anybody that and would use that as an excuse to get the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution would be a blank check to say Johnson could do whatever he wanted in Southeast Asia because of communist aggression. It was built on a lie. This would be the justification to send ground troops into South Vietnam. It was unanimous in the House, and all but 2 members of the Senate would vote against it. And boy, would there be anger down the road when doubts about the second attack. Now we know it did not happen. And think about it for a second. We've heard this before. Remember the Maine? 1898. Or the Mexican War, saying U.S. dragoons were attacked north of the Rio Grande, which we don't know. Justification now for the 3rd war, right here, built on a lie. And this will happen one more time, 2003, where President Bush is going to say, we know for a fact Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and we have to stop them. And not only did they not have weapons of mass destruction, he had no idea, he lied. Another thing. So now Johnson, tough, but not escalating yet. Tough, not blowing the world up. And that is going to lead to the most famous television ad in history. Do you want to see it? Do you want to see? The most famous television ad. It was only ran one time, but it could portray Johnson as the peacemaker, as the moderate. Do you want to see it? Yeah, of course I'm going to show you Ike. Come on, just admit it. Okay, here it is. The dates he had. Only showed it once. It was so controversial. It's very subtle. Subtle. That's a great ad. And so, played on everyone's fear. And the election victory would be unprecedented. The biggest popular vote victory in American history for president. To this day, Johnson was swept in, so popular it's hard to even put in terms, but you can see it. The Southern strategy is beginning to work. So you can imagine what the next Republican is going to do. That man, Richard Nixon.
Nixieland is Nixon.
Yeah, Nixon, I told my class a few years ago that the only president I really I will tell you honestly, I hate is Richard Nixon. I despise that person. And so, of course, when my students made me that poster, I put it up. Yeah.
What happened in Arizona?
That's where Goldwater was from. And that's a pretty Republican state. Now, this would have been the perfect time for Johnson to say, South Vietnam is a victory, and pull American advisors out because he just won this big victory. But he couldn't do that. And then things start to go to hell in South Vietnam. Absolute hell. But more importantly, the Civil Rights Act never said anything about voting. And they won the voting right. It was shocking important. That wasn't the thing. You got voting. Johnson tried begging them, wait, just like Kennedy did back in '63. And that's going to lead to the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights. It's going to happen twice. The first time they will be attacked by Alabama State Police under the control of George Wallace. Well, Johnson now knows I have to do something about voting rights. This is the important thing. Yeah, Johnson deserves a lot of credit, but the credit really should go to those brave women and men who did the civil disobedience, marched here. They're the ones who pushed the action. They're the ones who forced it. This never would have happened if not for their bravery. Direct action. And sometimes you go against, well, as I showed you, many Americans were opposed. And Johnson then realized we have to do something about civil rights. We have to do something. At the same time, Vietnam is going badly. What happens if the South Vietnamese government falls, which it looked like it might? And some American airmen died when a U.S. air base in South Vietnam was attacked. So nothing happens in a vacuum. Right after Selma, Johnson announced Operation Rolling Thunder, sustained bombing of North Vietnam. The idea is we bomb enough places in North Vietnam, they'll come to the peace table. We totally underestimated the fact that the Vietnamese wanted to be one Vietnam, not two. But now we have more air bases. So, troops. Johnson ordered the U.S. Marines, not advisors anymore, but regular ground forces, to land at a place called Da Nang, which was a harbor right here. They hit the beaches like they're at Normandy. They were actually met by young South Vietnamese girls with candy and flowers to greet them. It was really surreal. But they were to protect air bases. But now we have ground troops potentially in combat. And they don't want to sit and not fight because the Viet Cong started lobbing mortar shells at them. Guerrilla fighting, mortar shells, very efficient for this. But now Johnson, to his point of view, I've handled Vietnam. It was no coincidence, just a couple days after this, major escalation, which he kind of downplayed. He went on national television and demanded a Voting Rights Act. But now you can't say he's not tough on communism. He thought, I solved this problem. Was that necessary? He thought so. Looking back, no. He demanded it. And now it's going to go to the Senate, and it's going to be shepherded through the Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield of Montana, to get a Voting Rights Act. And you'll notice right here, airstrikes, rolling thunder. Nothing happens in a vacuum. They weren't separate events. Escalation in Vietnam, Johnson thought he needed because he wanted his great society. So after this, in June of 65, because the Army told him we needed it, he very just casually announced he's sending more regular ground forces. That means war. The United States now is going to be involved in keeping that government in South Vietnam there. This is what we call the Vietnam War. Justification, the Tonkin Gulf. And his reasons were, he thought he had to do it to save the Great Society. Ironically, Vietnam would destroy much of the Great Society because it would become so controversial. That and the backlash. Also, JFK made Vietnam important. He didn't want Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, to use this against Johnson in '68. He despised Robert Kennedy. The feeling was mutual. And credibility. If we're going to defend Europe and West Berlin, we got to defend our allies everywhere, or we won't look credible. So he's thinking, he was told, we have to do this. All his major advisors, he had a meeting of the National Security Council, 18, these are men, this is 1965, 17 of them said, just a few troops and some more bombing and we'll win. And they kept secret from the American public that it's going to take years to build up enough men to really make a difference, like the end of 67. And it's going to take well over 500,000 men. That means they're going to have to start drafting people. That means they're going to start dramatically increasing the size of the army. They didn't take the National Guard. They didn't take the Army Reserve. They just drafted more young men. So those are the reasons. I can't emphasize this enough. Robert Kennedy was out there saying, he was a new senator from New York at this time, he's destroying my brother's legacy in Vietnam. So we're jumping right here. It seemed to work. Medicare, health insurance for the elderly passed. Medicaid, health insurance for lower income. I should add, most of Medicaid actually goes for the elderly too. 70% of all nursing homes paid for by Medicaid. And Voting Rights Act. Nursing homes are so expensive. The Voting Rights Act passed. I should add that the current Supreme Court has gutted most of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act now is pretty much gone. And their reasoning were, and I'm not exaggerating, what they said was that racism is over, it's not needed. And their justification was that we had a President Obama.
Do you think there'll be studies like this November on like the rates of what they bring to like to see if that really is?
They already have.
Is there differences? Yeah.
So, Vietnam, search. So now the United States is going to slowly build up forces. The problem is, how do you fight a guerrilla army? That every time large American forces attack, they fall back in the jungle and the mountains. They called it search and destroy. And search and destroy was this. We would send small units out with the hope they get, and I'm not making this up, ambush by the Viet Cong. And then, if they ambush, we know where they're at, and then we use our superior firepower and blow it away. Which you can imagine is going to be so hard on the troops. The instances of battle fatigue was so high, today we say PTSD. So much higher than, let's say, World War II or even World War I. We have similar things happening for veterans in Iraq and Afghanistan now. It's going to one of the many tunnels right there, they call them tunnel raids. And it's going to be attrition. Can we kill so many of the Viet Cong that they have to quit? And so they would count the number of dead, they call them body counts, they would do kill ratios, our US versus, or South Vietnamese US forces versus Viet Cong. And and they exaggerated the body counts. That's how you got promoted. We had no idea what was going on. Killed a lot of people. But the big thing was our main weapon, firepower. Massive amounts of bombs, napalm. We even used B-52s that were designed to bomb the Soviet Union. They packed them with 70,000 pounds of conventional bombs that would rain death. And I got to tell you one thing. These bombs can't tell the difference between a kid and a Viet Cong soldier. The vast majority of those who were killed in this war are going to be civilians. The vast majority. In the South. We devastated the South. And that is, of course, napalm, that's jelly gasoline. And killed a lot of Viet Cong, without a doubt. But North Vietnam began to send troops into South Vietnam, just like the U.S. sent troops. They matched the escalation. And then, this is one of the most famous pictures of the war. That is a South Vietnamese napalm attack in the back. See the smoke? So using U.S. planes, it was an A-37 dropping U.S.-made napalm by the DuPont Corporation. And her clothes were burned off. She has burns, third-degree burns over 80% of her body. She is in absolute agony. She's running because they burned off. You can't see it because it's black and white, but skin is just peeling off of her. She's still alive. Somehow she survived. But that picture would be one of the symbols of war. But it was not U.S. planes who did it, but the U.S. supplied the South Vietnamese planes who did it. Does that make sense to everybody? And we also used a defoliant. We thought if we killed the jungle off, then the Viet Cong would have no place to hide. So they dropped millions of gallons of Agent Orange. Agent Orange, it was a really dangerous, it's illegal in the United States now, defoliant that kill plants. It had an orange label on the barrel. And this is going to cause horrific birth defects and cancer about anybody who is sprayed with it. Still affects Vietnamese today, and over 1 million U.S. soldiers who were hit with it, including my uncle, who was in Vietnam and would die of liver cancer because of this, because of Agent Orange. And Uncle Bill. While this is going on, anti-war protests increased. Now, the vast majority of Americans were still for the war until '68, but the anti-war protests increased. And this was a real cross-section of society. There's this belief that it's going to be a bunch of a term that was used a lot this time, usually misused, like hippies or... No, there's a real cross-section. And wealthy people could avoid the draft by either going to college or getting a friendly doctor or a friendly political connection to get them out. And so, just imagine what happened to college enrollment. But they could avoid it. And here, you have a series of counter-protests that would also happen. I just thought this counter-protest was really funny. One guy carried a sign that says, "Every communist is a fake." I can't help but to laugh at that. But this was really a protest to get American boys home. What is the fight about? But most Americans were like, well, we have no choice, we have to do it. But that wasn't the only thing going on at this time. Oh, I got to skip this. Also called the Long Hot Summers. I know. The Long Hot Summers. Yeah, I'm getting as far as I can go. Do the best I can. Aren't I amazing? Thank you. You're the best. I can tell my emotion like, shut up. All right, the Long Hot Summers. And they started in places like Newark, Watts, Detroit, but it's soon all over. You have significant numbers of African Americans who thought, with the Civil Rights Act, things are going to change, more job opportunities, better opportunity for education, college. No, it didn't happen. And this is going to lead, ironically, right after the Voting Rights Act, and for the next 5 years, a series of riots are going to be called race riots. Angry over the fact in the North there was, it's called de facto, meaning it wasn't legal segregation, but it was just happening, black areas and white areas. And demanding economic justice. And these riots, of course, are going to get out of hand, they're out of control. And this was what Martin Luther King feared. And others. If this turns to violent, that will give the backlash an excuse to say, look what happens when you give them rights.
What are the years for that?
65 to 70. Every summer. And you would not believe what happened. They're going to send ill-trained National Guard who had no idea what to do. There would be gunfights. In Newark, police snipers started killing every black man they saw. one by one, and it turned into just unbelievable. It's gonna be on Life magazine, a really famous picture of a 13-year or 10-year-old boy that was school by Oh, things got out of control. Wait a second. So I said, if enough people want to do it, I'll meet at lunch. What time are we meeting tonight? 6. Hey, if you're gonna be gone tomorrow, quick see me. I got a practice test. I went as far as I could go. I know I didn't quite cover as far as I wanted, but I got almost all of it. You got to fill in the gaps. The thing to do it on your own, fill in the gap. Here we go. Bees in the back? Yeah. No, I'm just joking. What you're doing? What is this? Oh. Keys in the back.
The keys in the back.
So I didn't quite finish up.
Keys in the back?
Yeah.
You did.
I tried. What's it? Don't work for the models.
What do you personally think about the GSC assessment?
Not even one single. It's never been harder. But it's fascinating to me to watch the teachers. What do you think? I know a lot about it, so I grab it.
Yeah, you know much more than I do.
And we actually do a unit special topic. It's in a really interesting.
I think the magic bullet is really weird. I mean,
You miss. We'll talk about some other time. Yeah. I'll try to record. You're on the roof. So, oh, so when you saw like anger or maybe race down the road, there's a reason. You're going first. Actually, I think I said someone else go first. You go. Yeah. Just remind me when we'll figure it out. No, tomorrow. Yeah, I'm just gonna peek out and make sure. Here. I enough people want to do it. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay.
So does they.
Yeah, and tonight at 6. Yeah.
So does they.
I figured there'd be enough. Yeah.
Okay.
I will go over a lot, and I did like. Oh yeah. Here. We're just gonna practice assessment class and keys and back. Just do the multiple choice. Yeah. And don't worry. Just need to practice. I think you're gonna be fine. Yeah, you've been gone forever. Oh yeah. Okay, so we just did it. We've done a ton of notes. And did you got the practice test last one? Didn't you? Yeah. So yeah. Get that one. I know. Huh? Yeah, that's good. You want to get over 33. Over 33. Over 38 is good. Over 44 is good. And so you're right in that area. You're good. And there's always going to be that first time the way they write questions. So the second one, I think you do better. We'll do one more tomorrow. I did on Wednesday. Yeah, I'll do one. Not people want to go. And I go through a ton of stuff. You were here yesterday, you know how much stuff I go. But did we get a lot done? We might have. I'm trying to get as far as I can get, but I'm not going to make it.
You should do page 10 today.
So I might go through everything on that last one,
Whole thing.
and then you guys can record it and give it, I'll record it. I don't know, but I am gonna review today at 6, and tonight at 6, and that's the thing, I'm gonna give you a few hints, talk a little bit more about the actual test, and then answer questions. And the big thing is just kind of get stuff in your head. So when you have to brainstorm, you remember it, or you see a word, oh, yeah, I remember that. Now, I'm not kidding. I think most of you are going to take the exam are going to do well. Only problem I have is I have no idea what the questions are going to be. So you just have to roll with the punches and do your best. Who's taking an AP test tomorrow? So we got a couple. Yeah, same deal. You know what they're like. If you get questions that are weird, answer the best you can and move on. Just do your best. Your best is going to be great. And you know what?
How many pages do you think I should skip through and leave blank so I can fill
Okay,
in?
I don't know. You're coming along.